After World War II drew to a close in the mid-20th century, a new conflict began. Known as the Cold War, this battle pitted the world's two great powers, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, against each other. Beginning in the late 1950s, space would become another dramatic arena for this competition, as each side sought to prove its superiority of its technology, its military firepower, and, by extension, its political and economic system. 50 years ago this July, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. We are going to look at the space race. This is the story of the first man on the moon. Right now, on Nova.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by the following. The David H. Koch Fund for Science, supporting NOVA and promoting public understanding of science. And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Space exploration served as another dramatic arena for Cold War competition.
In total, it is estimated that NASA spent approximately $25 billion on space race programs, and it is estimated that the Soviet Union spent between $4.8 to $10.1 billion on their own programs.
On October 4th, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik. Russian for Traveler, the world's first artificial satellite and the first man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch came as a surprise, and not a pleasant one, to most Americans. In the United States, space was seen as the next frontier, a logical extension to the grand American tradition of exploration, and it was crucial not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. In addition, this demonstration of overwhelming power of the R-7 missile, seemingly capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to the U.S. airspace, made gathering intelligence about Soviet military activities particularly important.
Sputnik 1 and 2, and we will destroy the Americans. I, Yuri Gagarin, will be the first person onto the moon.
Later that May, President John F. Kennedy made a bold public claim that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. In February 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth, and by the end of the year, foundations for NASA's lunar landing program, dubbed Project Apollo, were in place.
So it is not surprising that some would have us stay where we are a little longer, to rest, to wait. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. We shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
President Kennedy would not live to see his plans become a reality. On November 22, 1963, he was assassinated during a campaign motorcade in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, just 2 years after declaring to Congress that the U.S. would have a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
On July 16, 1969, U.S. astronauts Neil Armstrong, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins set off on the Apollo 11 space mission, the first lunar landing attempt. After the landing successfully on July 20th, Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon's surface. He famously called the moment, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Apollo 11 was the spaceflight that landed the first 2 people on the moon. Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin, both American, landed the Apollo lunar module, Eagle, on July 20th, 1969. Armstrong became the first person to step onto the lunar surface 6 hours later, and Aldrin later joined him. Apollo 11 was launched by a Saturn V rocket from Kennedy Space Center on July 16th and was the 5th crewed mission of NASA's Apollo program.
Hello and welcome back to NASA News. I am here with the one and only Neil Armstrong to talk about his trip to the moon. Good evening, Mr. Armstrong.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here.
So, tell me, what is space like?
There ain't no damn commies, I can tell you that much, Alex.
Well, you got a good point there, but did you ever feel threatened during your process of going to the moon by the communists?
Khrushchev never had a chance. Sputnik may have been the first, but we always finish what we start.
That is a very bold statement. What would you say to Khrushchev if he was sitting here right now?
I have great respect for what Khrushchev and those cosmonauts have been doing over there. However, Sputnik may have been one small step for man, but we, NASA, America, were one giant leap for mankind when we landed on the moon.
Go.
Mr. President.
Lieutenant.
Did you know that after the Apollo 11 landed on the moon's surface in July of 1969, there were 6 more Apollo missions by the end of 1972? By landing on the moon, the United States effectively won the space race that had begun with Sputnik's launch in 1957. For their part, the Soviet Union made 4 failed attempts to launch a lunar landing craft between 1969 and 1972, including a spectacular launch pad explosion in July of 1969. From beginning to end, the American public's attention was captivated by the space race, and the various developments by both the Soviet Union and the United States space programs were heavily covered in the national media. This frenzy of interest was further encouraged by a new medium of television. Astronauts came to be seen as the ultimate American heroes, and earthbound men and women seemed to enjoy living vicariously through them. Soviets, in turn, were pictured as the ultimate villains, with their massive, relentless effort to surpass America and prove the power of the communist system. With the conclusion of the space race, U.S. government interest in lunar missions waned after the early 1970s. In 1975, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts into space aboard an Apollo spacecraft that docked in orbit with a Soviet-made Soyuz vehicle. When the commanders of the 2 crafts officially greeted each other, their handshake in space served to symbolize the gradual improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations in the late Cold War era.